Hey everybody, welcome back. I am excited to bring, I think we're going to have a series of videos on the channel. Today is going to be part one. I'm going to see if I can get part two to y'all this week as well. And whether it's called something snappy like Tier List Tuesdays, I'm not really sure. I want to commit to putting more content on the channel about the metagame. You know, when we get a patch, and I did a patch rundown, I don't know, it's a bunch of numbers, right? You're like, I don't really know what this means, Tim. Like, I'm not sure how much this is going to change things. And even when you theorize things, really, you don't know how they're going to play out. But I think it's really helpful. New players, mythic players, medium tier players, wherever you are in this game, you're always thinking about matchups, right? You're thinking about, okay, well, here's what my deck's trying to do. Is that pretty effective into this deck? And I think meta sort of like is also above that, right? It's like, okay, I'm seeing a lot of aggro. What deals with aggro? Seeing a lot of control. What deals with control? And I don't know about you, but this Chandra Planeswalker I've been seeing all over the ladder, and I think we're gonna go over the reasons why, and just how, I sort of put it in the thumbnail for the patch rundown. It feels like aggro is back, baby. It feels like there were enough changes through some of the most kind of prolific decks like Teferi, which was really had like kind of a vice grip, I think, on a lot of the game last patch. I think a lot has changed, and metas will kind of ebb and flow. I think, for week one, right? We're a full week into the meta. I think it's time to sit down and talk some shop, and hopefully it gives a bit of context to why certain decks are popping up, and what might be a way to deal with them. And I'm going to hop over to our handy dandy tier list tool here, where we actually have the complete Planeswalkers, unlike my last tier list video. And I'm going to break it down. I wish I could go through all of it tonight, but I think it's more helpful for me to talk about 5 standout Planeswalkers and why I feel that they stand out. And then I can kind of give you guys a bit of a picture of where I would put them in the tier list. But I think we have to start with Chandra. I've been in top 20 in Mythic the last 2 months, and before that, I forget exactly where I finished, but I'm always doing my best to grind it up and learn and get better. And I can't remember the last time I was like, ooh, I want to play a Chandra deck in Mythic. Does it happen? Has it been fine before this? Yeah. But I think we got to talk about why you might be seeing Chandra on the ladder, because I know I've been seeing her. And I do think that she is a very viable option right now. And there are a few reasons why. And we did talk a little bit about it during the patch rundown, but some life gain, like Teferi's Absorb, got nerfed. She got a +1 damage on her passive, so she deals 5 at the start of the game instead of 4. Blitzing Minotaur, which we'll get into a deck list pretty soon, got a +1 power buff, which I do think is a noticeable increase when it's already a 3/3 haste at 3 mana, which is like a pretty decent rate for an aggressive deck. Got that little bump there. And just with how, when everyone's trying to figure out how you tune your deck, aggro could be a really, really strong option because you have one very succinct and very clear strategy. While the other mid-range decks, might be kind of figuring it out, Chandra has a way of just hitting you in the face and getting you down to 0. And she's really effective at that, especially when we're still working out what does the patch note mean, and who benefited, who really had a lot of drawbacks from it. And I think Chandra just right now has a lot of power that she did not before. I don't know that she's S tier. I think we're going to talk about at least 2 other aggro decks today, one of which I'm sort of theorizing that it's a bit better than Chandra, but let's get into a list and kind of get away from the general talk. I want y'all to kind of be able to conceptualize with me why this deck might be good. And sorry, it's 29 out of 30 cards because I'm missing a Looting Lizard, and I probably should craft it, but I just kind of wanted to put this up with the cards that I have. So first off, there are a couple builds floating around. I think Green-Red Chandra is a really good starter deck, right? Colonian Tusker, Giant Growth, the 4/5 haste for 4, just a lot of stats, a lot of damage early. I think it is really good, but I do think in the more competitive, kind of higher tier, I think Chandra with Black Splash gets a lot out of it. And you'll already spy that we've got two sneak creatures here. And why sneak is important in this deck is it guarantees damage, right? Unless they interact with your creature, it guarantees damage. Now, having a 4/5 haste, be able to come in and attack, right? It's sort of guaranteeing damage, right? In the sense that it's haste, so your opponent can't really respond to it, right? They can only block it. But I think, a 4/5 with haste can get chump blocked, right? Silent creatures. Thinking about Silent Prowler. Sneak creatures can't be blocked at least that first time, right? And what that means is you're guaranteeing the damage as long as the creature isn't killed the turn prior. And also, sneak creatures tend to be a little bit cheaper on the curve. And when you're trying to get as much out of your aggressive deck as possible, you're usually going to be keeping the curve pretty low. Now, a land that I haven't really talked about in a long time is Active Volcano, and I do think it was still viable, like before this patch, but it's just gotten better. When you get +1 damage on your passive, when some Planeswalkers are losing a bit of life gain or a little bit of efficiency, Active Volcano also going off on turn 6 instead of turn 5, right? It's not disrupting your curve. And that's something that I will always talk about, is if your top end is a 5-mana spell, you don't really want to be playing a card that, a land that can go off on turn 5, right? Like, is it backbreaking? Is it going to destroy your game plan? Not necessarily, but I think we really underestimate the idea of just having a deck that will purely curve out turns 1 through X, and then you give yourself the most efficient turn by, okay, when my land goes off, it is not disrupting anything that I'm doing. It is purely like a free spell that is not taking up any sort of slot. And I think that is the best way to deck build, in my opinion. But I think it varies, and I think there's a couple percentage points here and there. But I think if you're playing a cheap deck like this, where you've got Silent Prowler that can guarantee damage, you've got Ragerunner that can guarantee damage, you've got Ball of Lightning that's trampling through, and you've got a full 20 points, a total of 20 points of damage to the face. 2 shocks, 2 flame shots, that's 6 + 4 is 10, plus 2 lava axes is another 10, right? And Fire Elemental also, even if it doesn't connect against your opponent, right, it can connect for 2 damage minimum if it gets to attack. So, I mean, some Planeswalkers don't have 25 life, right? So, you can kind of see how, this sort of like, not really like a burn strategy per se, but guaranteeing and sticking as much damage before your opponent can stabilize is really good in a meta where people are still figuring out how to answer aggressive decks. And Chandra just got, some pure bumps and some other decks did not. And I think that's why she is at the very least, I would say, A tier. I don't know that she's S. I don't know that, like, just going back here, just so we're all on the same page. I'm going to say that Chandra is, like, one of the better aggro options. I do think that she and another aggro planeswalker that we'll talk about, I think are the best aggro options. And also what's nice about Chandra is, like, typically she, is not super costly to build, so that's really nice, for new players too. Like, you can potentially be playing, like, a very, very competitive build of a planeswalker without having to invest that much. So I figured we had to start with our girl Chandra because it's just the first time in a while where this planeswalker feels like very present in the meta and very competitive. Whether you're running red-green, haste, or red-black sneak, I think she just has, or just like mono-red, I think she has a lot of validity, and that's probably why we're seeing it a lot. So let me talk about the other 2 aggro decks, and then we'll get into 2 decks that I think are also still showing up in the meta, and I think it's important for us to talk about why. But I think I'll come back to Nahiri. Let's talk about Yanling for a second. So I'll just throw up a deck list while we kind of generally talk about her. And I'll be honest, I don't have that many games on Yanling. Obviously, we threw up a deck list for the channel of kind of first try, and I think there's definitely iterating to be done. But I think so. I think Yanling is, pretty underpowered. Like I think, and what I mean by underpowered is that she beats the decks she's supposed to, right? Which I would say is like really any sort of kind of control deck or any deck that takes a bit to kind of get online, or that is not teching in things like Vine Snare Hunter, right, where it comes into play, all creatures lose flying. If people are not teching against Mu Yanling, I think she can be really strong because, just having flyers and honestly, I think one of the standout cards is Guard the Flock. I think someone else said that in one of my videos too. It's just a really cheap and efficient card, very much like Shock, right? Where like Shock, you're usually using, it's 1 mana for 2 damage. You can easily trade for their 2-drop for 1 mana. And Guard the Flock is potentially trading for even more mana when you prep it because people are, playing point, just sort of point removal. And you're like, imagine your opponent plays Flagrant Foul on your, your Dungeon Geist or your Pixie Trickster or River Dragon, right? And then you've just had guard the Flock up for 1 mana to counter their 4-drop. So there's a clear, solid mana exchange that's happening there. I think that Yanling is probably going to need some help in the future. She can be really powerful. I think some of the draws that we even had in our last video, showcased how if you can get the ball rolling, she can be incredibly strong. And against decks that are not really interacting her, not really racing her, she can be good. But I don't think Yanling is really built for a meta that is prioritizing aggro. I mean, even just thinking about Flame Shot coming from Chandra, Shock, having even Minotaur, which you can't really block until later. There's a lot of vulnerability to aggro. But so right now, I'm putting Yanling in, I think, B tier, potentially B or C. I think she wins matchups that both Gideon and Kaya win. I don't know that she's necessarily better than those decks, but this sort of like go wide, evasive. I mean, she's a little bit more similar to Kaya, I would say, in deck construction. It's like you're playing evasive threats that can net you card advantage, right? Which is what Kaya's passive does. And sort of like, Gideon, you're going wide. You're maybe using, your Aura of Courage from your Paladin class. I think these are all potentially viable aggro options right now. Are they the best aggro options? I don't think so, because they're still very vulnerable to certain sweepers like Pyroclasm or Infest, right? And like when people kind of just have their builds more solidified, they're going to lose power. But I do think, we'll put these guys down here and talk about them a little bit more in the next video. I do think that Yanling is competitive. I just don't think if you want to get as many trophies in Mythic, I don't think that Yanling is probably going to be the answer. But I do think she's viable. I think it's going to take time for us to figure out what is the optimal build. But I wanted to shout her out because people are playing her. I'm sure if anyone was playing during the first couple days last week when the patch dropped, you were probably seeing a lot of her, right? Because she just came out. So I wanted to just at least get my initial thoughts, kind of on paper as it were, and let you know that she can beat the matchup she's supposed to beat, but there's just a large percentage of the field that I think she's really going to struggle with for the time being. I don't know that, when the dust settles, she might be one of the better aggro options because she can play evasive threats and like has a good amount of card advantage. And honestly, maybe that ends up being better than something like Chandra with brute force damage or kind of the mixture of the two, which is Nahiri. So I think that's a really good place to transition for Nahiri. And I do think that Nahiri is a better aggro option than Chandra. I think it's close, but I think that also Nahiri, if we think about her playing in the context of an aggro meta, she has cards, even just her signature 2/1 for 2 haste. I'll throw up a deck list while we're talking about this. With armor, right, is likely to trade. Where are you, Nahiri? It's been a while since I played you. Okay. Just one of her signature cards, Core Recruit, right? It's a 2/1 haste for 2 with armor. And you can pump it, right, with your passive, which gives it +2/+0, making it a 4/1 armor haste threat. This thing is just going to be really efficient in an aggro meta, right? It's trading for likely 2 of your opponent's 1 or 2 drops, right? While potentially even pushing damage if they really don't want to block it. I think some builds run Path of the Barbarian, which also got a buff, and I think that is why Nahiri is a little bit more competitive. Making Mindless Rage cost 1 less is a noticeable buff. Again, sometimes when we're thinking about numbers in this game, it's hard for us to really conceptualize, okay, what's the difference between a 3-drop and a 2-drop? I would just say very simply, a card that used to come down a turn later, it's going to be a buff for it to come down a turn earlier. A turn makes a huge difference, especially when we think about aggro, because you're trying to apply pressure using cheap, efficient cards to get underneath your opponent before they set up, their defenses, so to speak. So when Mindless Rage is able to come down and kill one of their blockers a whole turn earlier, that is absolutely a noticeable buff to that sort of strategy. And I don't know that this deck construction is ideal. This is kind of a mixture of decks that I've seen from teammates and other folks who are really experienced. Mr. Aardvark, who's someone who joined our team recently, has been playing a ton of Nahiri, and I actually was going to throw up their build, but unfortunately it didn't. It dissolved in our team chat, so I couldn't see it. But I think there are some standout cards I'll talk about here, but I think the main reason Nahiri kind of stands out is she still has evasion. She hits hard like Chandra, although it's not necessarily what I would call guaranteed damage, right? Because you're not running stuff like Lightning Axe, Lightning Axe. I'm looking at Lightning Helix, Lava Axe. You are running Shock. You don't have access to Flame Shot like Chandra does, but you've got these really cheap creatures that are hitting your opponent for basically minimum 4. I mean, 2-headed Hellhound, when it comes down and you equip it with the sword, right, her passive, it's dealing 6 damage for 2 mana, right? I mean, that is really, really powerful when you consider, okay, I'm on the draw, right? Or even if I'm on the play, I go 1-drop. Okay, shock your 1-drop, equip my Hellhound, attack you for 6. And then I've got a Path of Barbarian that can also pump it. But the real key to this deck is evasion, right? So Ball of Lightning, I wouldn't say this has evasion, but it's got trample, so you can push damage, right? I mean, pumping this to an 8/1, very easy to do. You do it on turn 4, right? Or when you have a fragile mana gem, and you're crashing and connecting for a lot of damage. But Sky Knight Legionnaire, even though it's a 3-mana 2/2 flying haste, which is a fine rate, but always in my mind I have this mental block where I'm like, is that actually good enough? It is, because getting a hasted attacker is one thing, but getting a hasted flying attacker is another thing. And when you're playing stuff like Will Smith, aka Willful Smith, Will Smith is buffing your blade so that you're playing Sky Knight Legionnaire, it's getting +3/+0, attacking for 5, and if you've got Path of the Barbarian and you have Indomitable Strength, right, you're hitting them for 5 from this, and then you're hitting them for 5 in the air. I mean, you can see how the deck can just really pump damage in a way that other decks are going to struggle addressing, because you're either hitting them early when they haven't set up their defenses, or later in the game if they are not teching specific cards to deal with flyers or haste creatures for that matter. It's going to be really hard for your opponent to stabilize. And I think, although if you were just playing Chandra versus Nahiri, Chandra does have one of the best cards, which is Flame Shot. I do think that if you're able to match her point for point early, we've got access to Stoneforge Mystic, potentially Path to Exile if we need it. We've got evasive creatures like Sky Knight Legionnaire, Inferno. We've got Lightning Helix to help stabilize. I do think that the matchup's probably pretty close. But I think Nahiri definitely has kind of more gas to get across the finish line. That's kind of my initial impression. And Moreland Haunt, when you're playing stuff like, Zozu, even Inferno, Will Smith for the debut trigger, Sky Knight Legionnaire, getting a 1/1 flyer, isn't bad in this deck because by turn 6, it's probably going to be a 4/1 flyer with your passive from Will Smith. So I think, and the fact that Nahiri's Outburst is also, relatively cheap, although there is, there's a little bit of having to plan ahead for it. And I think Path to Exile, I go back and forth on, right? I think Power Word Stun was kind of necessary for a time to deal with Liliana. I think people are kind of tired of the deck. I think people are interested in trying other things. Liliana I think, is vulnerable to aggro. She does really well into mid-range, and she can win control matchups, but aggro, unless you are guaranteeing that Grim on turn 3 or 4, you're probably going to lose the game. And the deck's got enough kind of weird pieces to be inconsistent enough that I think Chandra and Nahiri have a pretty good time into it. I would definitely take that side of the matchup, not having played it that much, but just in theory. So, is this the optimal deck construction for Nahiri? I don't know. I think it's got some cool kind of one-ofs, and this was a list that, personally, if I was going to fire it up, I think is good. And I think there is a card that I almost forgot to tell us before we move on about, is Untamed Rage. So if a friendly creature is blocked, give it +3/+0 and trample. And this card, if anyone's ever played with an effect like this in Magic the Gathering, and I think it's Run Amok, was 2 mana for +3/+3 and trample. It's always been a really powerful effect in aggro decks, because it's just, you're paying 2 mana for 3 power, and when you're trampling with potentially even a core recruit, right, or Will Smith, who's a 4/3, Taijik, right, who's a 5/3, you're just, or Zozu for that matter, right, which can be immense creature in the late game. Untamed Rage is a way of pseudo giving your creatures evasion, because they're able to push the damage over the creature's toughness. So I think if you have not played with Untamed Rage, I think you should try it. I don't have a ton of games with it, but I will say I think it is a card that is very much worth considering right now, especially for Nahiri, because I think it really benefits her playstyle. And I do think Path of the Barbarian is worth trying. Now, we're going to talk about, the last 2 decks, which is going to be Domri and Liliana, who I think, have ways of dealing with aggressive decks. But I think if you were to say, hey Tim, I want to rank up as much as I can, what are the 2 best aggro decks to play? Chandra, Nahiri. And I think I would probably side with Nahiri if I was to say which one would be a little bit more successful. So that's kind of my thought process with that. I don't know necessarily that we're going to talk about like what Planeswalkers are in S tier, because I think it's just really hard to tell, like, is there a standout like deck that is absolutely just demolishing people? I haven't seen it. I've seen a lot of aggro. I've seen mid-range start to attune to it. I did see Teferi. I think Teferi's still very viable, but I don't think I want to put the thought in anyone's heads that, like, here is a standout deck you should be playing. I really want to talk in kind of broader strokes of, like, what am I seeing, which I imagine you guys are seeing on the ladder, and how do we think about adjusting to that. So I'll save my best for last. Let's talk about Liliana for a second. Liliana basically barely got nerfed in the patch notes for anyone who, did not see my last video or just had not been tuned in for that. I think it was just, if I'm correct, Grimgrin went from a 9/8 to an 8/7, and Soul Silver Lich went from a 9/5 to an 8/4. I mean, like, the plus or minus one here or there, I guess, could make a difference in certain matchups where, like, you wouldn't just flat out die from a Silent Strike. But, like, the deck virtually didn't change. And I do think that it had ways of dealing with aggro in Break a Leg, in Grave Disturbance. In Drain Blood, even Corpse Conveyor can be pretty efficient, right? Because you're paying 3 mana to make a 2/2, and then the next turn you get a free 2/2, and Transparent Hallway. So like, you can definitely tech Liliana to deal with aggro more efficiently. Like if you're a Liliana fanatic, like our good old friend Tino here, then I think there are absolutely ways. Like you could play 2 Infest instead of 1, right? And you can sort of guarantee the ability to stabilize. I think that is, Liliana can be a bit more resilient to aggressive decks in that fashion. And I think she's still very, very viable, a very solid option. Now, since aggro decks have been a little bit more popular, I think you have to be mindful with how you're building her. But I do think she's still fairly strong, and I feel like this is where we're talking on the team the other day. I think that we're not maybe seeing as much Liliana because also people just want to try new things. And it's just like the 3 decks that stand out to me that have kind of not changed at all are Liliana, Domri, and Teferi. And they've been kind of ruling the meta for a while. Like, they've been kind of the ruling class, so to speak. And now we've got these other contenders that are kind of like challenging, okay, you guys are kind of doing like a mid-ranger control strategy. Some of you got nerfed, some of you didn't get buffed, right? And we got buffed, so now we're able to contend with you. And I do think Nahiri and Chandra are able to contend with those decks. Again, if you ask me, and I'm trying to really personalize this as if we're really having this discussion together. If you were to ask me, Tim, should I play Nahiri, Chandra, or Liliana? I would probably still tell you to play Nahiri or Chandra. I think Liliana can still have a lot of inconsistency, and I think, when you start to dilute the deck with like, okay, here's how I survive against aggro, sometimes it can get a little awkward, right? You might get a lot of your hands where you've got like your early answers, but then you don't really have your reanimator set up, and they're beating you in the face with like a giant, Sky Knight Legionnaire, or, they're beating you down and then getting you lower so they can lava axe you. I do think Liliana is still just really strong when it does the thing, right? When it gets that big zombie down early. But I don't think it's the end-all be-all like it felt necessarily in patches before. But she really wasn't touched, so I want to respect that she is still very much a contender. Even though I don't tend to play the deck that much, I still think that I would be remiss if I didn't say, hey, this deck didn't really get nerfed, so like that might make her decent for the meta. So I want to wrap up here and thank you all for sticking with it. I hope it's helpful for kind of hearing my thought process, and I'd love to hear yours in the comments section. So please like, comment, subscribe. Love to hear from all of y'all. As I've always said, the engagement on the videos has been so awesome. Like, I love just checking my phone, whether I'm at work sometimes or, just throughout the day or whatever, and seeing, oh, hey, this is my build. Oh, hey, what do you think about this? Like, oh, I noticed this moment. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Or here are my thoughts on that. It's just great. It makes it all worthwhile. So, I'm going to close out with my favorite Planeswalker, and I do feel a little guilty. I'm definitely a Domri enthusiast, and I know people can be really... I feel like I'll just say, because I've talked with Logan a bit, he's over this deck being in the meta, and I get it. Like, I've kind of always said on this channel, like, I think Domri's a great deck for climbing. Literally made a video about it a couple days ago. Couldn't even help myself. I was like, maybe I'll make a couple more videos of me climbing a mythic. I just did like, an hour and a half session or something with Domri, hit mythic. Because it's just, I still feel that it's just such an efficient deck at what it's doing. And so I'll throw up the builds for folks who had missed that. I don't know. I've got something going on with this Planeswalker. I was a big Ral fan for a while, and then I just like fully converted to the church of Domri. I think what I like about Domri is that it's just got this cool scalability where like you're playing sort of like an aggressive deck, but then you've got the option through the ramp package to play an 8-drop on turn 5 and then 7. and you can just like slam the door on your opponent as an aggro deck. That's sort of, it's like masquerading as an aggro deck. Because of the power of Gaia's Cradle, and I know other people build it another way, and I appreciate you guys, like, sometimes I forget, like, this deck takes a lot to craft. So, I know it's not always the most practical to talk about on the channel because, like, I don't know that it's realistic everyone can make these, has the materials. Like, the only way I did it was, like, I farmed those events that, come out once in a while. I think it was, like, after the new set was released a few months ago, where you could just, spend gems, and as long as you were playing well, you could win out and get a ton of materials. That was the only way I was able to make this for free. So, bear with me here. I think there are replacements you can do. Please comment if you're like, hey, Tim, I'm missing this, I'm missing that. What would you be running, in lieu of that? Like, I think someone was like, hey, I don't have General or Ulrich. What do you suggest running? And I think I was like, yeah, just run the Boar. That's a 4-mana 5/5. Like, it counts towards Channeler of Might in the same way, and it's still just like a rawly efficient creature. So it doesn't have to look like this, but I really like this build. I'm still a little iffy on if I need Centaur Sage in the same way. Like, I think maybe, honestly, one Centaur Sage, one Titan. Just because Titan can come down against the aggro decks and, like, maybe kill a creature that you really need to deal with. I think there's still some tweaking, but I think we got to talk about Domri because, Domri got a buff because Treetop Lookout went from a 3/2 to a 3/3, and you already wanted to run this card because it just makes the Teferi match winnable. And in my opinion, I think it's just been really good. It answers all of the early traps from Liliana when they're trying to gum up the board and slow you down while they get their combo pieces. And I've said this, in the last video, against Vivian and Domri in the mirror, or even Drist, right? Like, a Worm's Wake is pretty telegraphed, right? It's 3 mana in a green deck. Like, what other trap is it going to be? So when you see that, and you'll see me in the videos, like, I'm always thinking about what the opponent could be doing, and I just sort of, like, really quickly realize, like, what they're doing, then it might be worth it for me to blank their entire turn. Literally, it's like they just skipped their own turn by playing Treetop Lookout. And now it's a 2-mana 3/3. So, in my mind, I wanted to play this deck because, I feel like it's pretty easy to climb with. Like, once you get the sequencing down, it's just like, how much can you play around Lava Wave, right? Where it's going to just a one-sided Wrath for the most part. How do you really play against Craterhoof, other than trading off against creatures early? There's just not, like, a ton you can do if I'm allowed to get to a certain mana count with a certain amount of creatures. So it just made sense while people are testing different things, like Yanling, and I'm just kind of, like, beating them down with Domri. So, and the other reason I wanted to talk about the deck is I just do think it's a really good option. Like, it didn't get nerfed. He really has not been touched in any sort of way. It's like a little bit of a buff if Inferno Titan is actually good as I think it is, to have that as an option in the deck. And although people are teching, I think, to deal with Lava Wave in particular, because you can still block creatures, right, that are buffed by Craterhoof Behemoth. It is a deck that is really hard, I think, to play around in an effective way. Because when you're playing the Werewolf package, right, like Agitators, which is essentially a 4-drop, unless you have a Fragile Mana Gem to flip it on the same turn, or Hermit of the Flock, right, sort of same scenario where you're dropping it a bit later. Like, you can't interact with that, right, unless you're playing Teferi, right? Like, you just get to set the pace of the game because you're getting to play these werewolves that have these sort of multiplicative effects, or, like, stabilizing effects in Hermit of the Flock. And it's just like you can't really interact with it, right? Like, also, you can play Daybreak Ranger with 2 Fragile Mana Gems, which you saw in the videos is pretty easy to do, and you're just getting a 4-mana 5/4 that kills their best creature on the board, and you can't interact with it. Like, I just think that when you really know how to sequence this deck, when you really know how your opponent's going to try and interact with you, you can just, in my opinion, set the pace of the game so much better than any other deck. And although I played it a lot to get to Mythic, and I do recommend it alongside the other aggro options. I think that Domri's always kind of been the fair aggro deck, and if you haven't seen the MTG SS team, the MTG-SS.com meta breakdown, I definitely encourage you to do that. I always have the link for those different articles in my description. Domri has always above a 50% win rate. I think it was 56%, and for me, I always feel like it's a bit higher. I think it's just efficient at what it does. The games are also relatively quick for the most part. They're not crazy quick, but when people see the lava wave or the crater hoof, or it's getting close and you're already kind of have a bunch of boars and a bunch of wolves on the board. The games can be quick for grinding, but also I think the deck really rewards sequencing, and if you can really read what your opponent might be trying to do, I do think that it could be a really powerful option. And I've always felt, I was getting here, this is actually the point I was trying to get to. I think that Domri, and we'll flip over to our list here for a second, I think Domri does pretty well into aggro. I think with the combination, sort of flip back a little bit, Hermit of the Flock, right? A 1/4 for 3 that makes an extra body, and if you can flip it, it becomes a 4/4, which is a real threat. A real stat line that gains you 2 life. When you've got Channeler of Might coming down as a 1-mana 3/3, even Sundancer, right? Whenever you can flip it into a 4/3, Tusker, even Treetop Lookout. All of these creatures are really efficient early. If you get a good grudge match, then you play Gatstaff Agitators when you're a little bit more stable to accelerate your mana lead. You've got just efficient cards like Worm's Wake. You've got Answers in Daybreak. You've got, just a house of a card in Ulrich. If you have not crafted this and you can, this card does so much work, and it's good in Chandra red-green as well. The deck, and then you've got Birds of Paradise, which I want to talk about for a second. You might think this is a pretty do-nothing card against aggro, right? I mean, it's not trading with creatures, but that's not what it does. What it does for the deck is it enables all of your werewolves, and it's just a free block against a 5-power Sky Knight Legionnaire, right? And it essentially says, at some point in the game, block the biggest creature to save yourself some life. And the combination of Birds of Paradise, Hermit of the Flock, efficient things like Grudge Match and Daybreak Ranger and Ulrich, which can usually get an attack in and give you a free card, and Inferno Titan, I think, can be really backbreaking. I think this is just a really good choice into an aggro meta. Now, I think Nahiri it's a really close matchup. Might be a little bit favored for Nahiri. For Chandra, again, I think it's close, but I would say that Domri is a little bit favored. I don't think Chandra is quite efficient enough to get through all of the 3 toughness creatures. Yes, of course, you've got Flame Shot to answer 1. You've got Shock to answer some of the 2-power. I guess if you've got a Sundancer that's unflipped. But just once you get, if you stick a Worm's Wake, if you stick a Hermit of the Flock, if you stick a Ranger, it's just going to be really hard for them to punch through. Unless they've just really come out swinging and you've had no early interaction. You're just playing one of the the best 1-drop in the game, in Channeler of Might, and you've got Birds of Paradise to enable your werewolves. I just think that the deck has always had a pretty solid matchup into aggro. You still have to play it well. We lost to Angrath in my Domri video recently, but I think if you go back to the tier list for a second, I still think Domri's really good, even though Liliana answers him very well. I haven't been seeing as much Liliana, which makes me want to play Domri more. Because that matchup is really hard, although you can win it. Like I said in the last video, I could go 5-0 against Liliana because she doesn't draw her pieces, then I can go 0-5 against Liliana because she does. But I think if you were saying Tim, okay, what's a good deck to address aggro? I would pick Domri. I think it's also just good into other mid-range decks for the most part, like Kiora, like Vraska, like a Johnny, like Drist. right? Vivian, I think you're also favored because you're playing Lava Wave, you're playing Craterhoof Behemoth, you're playing werewolves that are big or can eat a creature for free. I think Vraska is probably due to address these aggro decks, and I think that's probably what we'll talk about either in the next part of this video. But I didn't. Again, I'm holding myself accountable here for you guys. I know this video is already long enough, and so I just wanted to talk about these 5 decks because I think we've got 2 breakout stars in the aggro category. We've got a breakout star, although I don't think it's the best aggro deck, because I do think that she can be pretty good. And I just wanted to talk at least about kind of 2 OGs, if you will, from the last patch that haven't really been touched in a real sense. Like Teferi definitely was kind of the one with the biggest target on their back, and I'll say spoiler alert, I would still put him, as like a pretty top tier deck. You do have to build him to beat aggro though, and I had gotten used to teching Teferi to beat Teferi, or Teferi to beat other controls that are mid range matchups. So you do have to change his deck construction when you want to address aggro. But these are my initial thoughts on the patch. We're seeing, I think, a lot more aggressive strategies, and I want to give you guys kind of the goods on, what am I doing to address it. So if you feel like you can't beat him, so you want to join him, I think you should be picking one of these 2 Planeswalkers here, Chandra or Nahiri. If you want to beat him and not join him, I think you can play Domri. I think you'd have to do a little bit of work with Liliana to tech against aggro, but it's definitely winnable. And if you're sick of losing to Domri and you've just hated playing against that matchup and you're seeing a lot of it, Liliana, I think, has always had a pretty good game, depending on your draw. I think if we end up, if I get some feedback where it's like, hey, can you talk a little bit more about how to beat a specific Planeswalker, I would happy to do, a bit of that in the next tier list video. So please give me a shout out here in the comments and say, hey, Tim, I'd love for you to single out this Planeswalker, or hey, can you talk about this specific interaction? But I would categorize these decks here, in week 1 of the patch. And these are sort of in the order that I would recommend them for kind of winning as much as possible. And let me know your thoughts. And, just, again, really appreciate all the engagement on the videos recently. It's good to be useful. And I really love this game. I really love the community. So I'm going to catch you hopefully again this week with the rest of the tier list. Maybe we'll break it up into 3 different parts because this game's got a lot of Planeswalkers in it, and I want to do y'all justice. But we started with the 5 that I felt like kind of are shaping a bit of the conversation in the meta right now, and I hope at the very least there was something y'all were able to take away. So as we close out here today, I'm sitting at number 26. I think I was at 15 yesterday, so people be playing. People are ranking up. And best of luck on your journeys ranking up here. Hope everyone's, getting to where they want to be, even in week 1. And I will catch you next time.